So the first part of our YAML file demonstrates how to create comments, and you can do it with a hashtag. So we have 3 lines of comments here. We have some extra white space after the comments. The white space between items doesn't matter, so you can have as many extra lines as you need in order to create separation. So the first structure that we're demonstrating here is an array without keys. Now there's 2 different ways to create an array. One is inline and one is on multiple lines. In this first one, what we do is create an indentation, which is just 2 spaces, a dash, and then the value. And we add multiple items to an array by adding multiple lines like this. So if we look at how this is rendered as a PHP variable over here, we have our base array here, and this is an array that wraps around all of the items inside of this YAML file. So we have this base one, and then within this, we have our array without keys, and you can see that it's a simple array, and the keys here are numerical. That's because this is not an associative array, this is just a basic array, and each item in the array is a string, and we got them all pulled in. And now the alternative syntax is to do it inline with square brackets. So we start with a square bracket on the left, we separate the items with commas, and then we have a square bracket on the right. And you can see that when it gets converted to a PHP array, it's identical to when we used multiple lines over here. All right, so now we know how we can deal with simple arrays. This next example shows that keys can be camel case and so can values. Previously, we used underscore just to separate words, but we can use camel case as well, and that's completely valid. They get passed over in their complete form. So you can see the capitals here in the key and the capitals in the value as well. You can also use spaces. Spaces are fine. So if we have spaces in the keys or spaces in the values, you can see that when they get converted to the array, the spaces are preserved, both in the key and in the value. Now, if you need to preserve spaces, notice over here that we have spaces are fine in keys, but then there's multiple spaces on the right. And then when we look at the key, once it gets converted to an array, that white space is taken away. We can keep that space by adding it within quotes. So up here, we didn't need to use quotes in order to use spaces, but if you want spaces on the sides of the value, you will need to add quotes and add the spaces inside of the quotes. And you can use double or single quotes. You can see single quotes being used for the value here and double quotes being used for the key, but you can use either one. If you need to add new lines in the key or the value, you want to use double quotes. This is a similar syntax to what you find in PHP. And then when you want to do new line, you're going to use a backslash and an N in order to indicate that. So you can see use double quotes for new lines here. And then over here, we have use double quotes for, and then it skips to the next line, new lines. And also if you want to use a single quote inside of single quotes, you're going to use 2 quotes. This is a little different than what you see in PHP. In PHP, you need a backslash, then a quote. In YAML, you want a quote and then a quote. You can see that this is being rendered over here as a single quote. Now the YAML parser will convert values to particular formats depending on the structure of the format. So for example, if we put true or false, we would get a Boolean value. Now just so you're not confused, what we're looking at here is an associative array. So above here we did a simple array using dashes, but when we do an associative array, we have the key on the left and the value on the right. Now we actually have already been seeing that because this whole bit up above here is inside of an array. The entire YAML file is an array. So this key value here is part of this associative array. But here what we're seeing is an associative array inside of the full YAML file associative array. So we have types as the key, and then the value is an associative array. On the left-hand side, we have the key. On the right-hand side, we have the values. But these values, in this one, are being converted just based on what the value is. Just to be clear, it has nothing to do with the fact that our keys say Boolean or integer or null or whatever. YAML just looks at the value and decides what type of variable it's going to be. So in this case, this is true, and when we see it converted over into PHP, it's assigning it a variable type of Boolean, which is either true or false. For an integer, we have a similar thing going on. It's 10 here, and when it gets converted over, it gets converted to an integer. Now this is pretty cool to me because it seems like YAML could take the easy way out and just convert everything over to a string because true could be a string, 10 could be a string as well, but instead it's taking its best guess at the type of variable it is and converting it over to that as part of the process. We can also use a null value. You can see that the value here is null. And I discovered in this process that in order to use null as a key without it messing things up, you actually had to put quotes around it. And notice that we're also adding an inline comment here at the end of a line, which we can do. Comments don't just have to be on their own lines. And as we continue down here, you can see that these various variables are being converted over. The float converts over to a float, 1.3 converts over to a float, 1.3. You can do hexadecimal, which converts over to an integer. And you can even do two different types of dates. This first date is if you just need a day, and it's going to be year, month, day. And you can see this converted over to a timestamp as part of the process. Or if you need to include time, you can use this format here, which is the ISO 8601 standard. It looks a little more complicated, but if you use this, it'll get converted over to a timestamp too. Okay, and there's a couple more types that we're not covering here, but this gives you a sample of the idea, at least, that types can be converted over without saying explicitly that they are a particular type.